he said that Donald Trump was dangerous. He said he was concerned about his state of mind. And in general, he said things that were quite displayed a difference in the way that he may view Donald Trump privately versus how he presents their relationship publicly.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday to Friday, on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today, I'm delighted to say, is Zoya Sheftalovich, Chief EU Correspondent at Politico. Zoya, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. It's been a busy 24 hours, let me tell you.
I'm sure we're used to that here. It seems to always be a busy 24 hours for us. Now, we are speaking together on the show today because you've co-authored a piece in the European edition of Politico that raised a few eyebrows, certainly in the UK yesterday. And it concerns comments that Politico claims the Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico made to EU leaders in Brussels last week around Donald Trump. We'll get into it in a little minute. Just tell us a little bit about the piece and what it concerns.
So we had an interesting European Council summit last week in Brussels. It was on Thursday night, and EU leaders gathered because basically Donald Trump had been increasing his threats to Greenland, and he had been essentially saying that he was going to impose tariffs on countries that ended up sending troops to Greenland, not to defend Greenland per se against the United States, but they were sending those troops because he had actually complained that the EU and European countries and Denmark hadn't done enough to protect Greenland from China and from Russia. And so we were at the European Council summit. And the way these things work is it's the 27 EU leaders, they sit around this big table and they make interventions. And that's kind of the formal part of the summit. But they need coffee breaks, they need to, go to the bathroom, they go and grab a snack. And so oftentimes when there's a break in proceedings, a group of them might gather and they might have an informal chat on the sidelines of that summit. And so what we had heard is that there had been a group of leaders gathered on the sidelines of that European Council summit. One of those leaders was Robert Fico, who is the Slovak Prime Minister. And famously, he's quite close to Trump. He gets Trump on the phone. He has meetings at Mar-a-Lago. So very unexpectedly, Robert Fico then, according to people who were briefed on this conversation, told those leaders that he had recently met with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and he said that Donald Trump was dangerous. He said he was concerned about his state of mind, and in general, he said things that were quite displayed a difference in the way that he may view Donald Trump privately versus how he presents their relationship publicly.
And those sort of comments came to Politico from a number of diplomats from different countries. Is that right?
That's right. So we're very transparent in this story. You will see when you read it, we don't say that we've spoken to the leaders in question. We have actually spoken with diplomats who were briefed on the comments. So, we wanted to be very clear as to where we got the information because we knew that what was going to happen was what has happened, which is a big backlash from Fico himself because it's not in his interests for a story like this to be out there. So, we understand why that has happened, but he's come out swinging. And we got a pretty strong response from the White House as well, who, of course, we went for a comment. But ultimately, we wanted to be super transparent with where this story came from. And we confirmed it. We have 5 sources, different, it's people from different countries and different places. So we made sure that we were, really doing our due diligence before we published. And we heard the first whispers of this on the Thursday, but we waited until this week because we wanted to make sure that we had got the story right and we had it enough from enough places.
Yeah, because the response from Fico, obviously, the top line was that I strongly reject the lies of the hateful pro-Brussels liberal portal Politico. But then he sort of said that he didn't speak at the informal summit in Brussels. No one heard anything. No one saw anything. There are no witnesses.
So I know he did not reject the underlying claims in the story. So, we never said that he spoke in the formal part of the summit. We know he didn't. This was definitely a sideline discussion. So, look, I think actually that statement, as I read it, was pretty clear in what he was not rejecting. So I think we stand by the reporting. We stand by the due diligence. We have really strong standards. We've got a standards editor. We ran it by them. We did our work on this one. It was not an easy story to stand up, let me tell you. So I'm confident about that. And that response from Robert Fico, I think, says it all, really. Oh, and I will hasten to add, sorry, I should add, I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea. Politico is certainly, it's neither pro nor anti-EU. It's neither pro or anti-Fico or Slovakia. We're very much, our Raison d'etre is a non-partisan media organization. We never back a side. We're neither left-wing nor right-wing. We often get accused by either side of politics as being, either left-leaning or right-leaning, depending on which side the various politicians are from. But I can tell you now, we're very much down the line. We're not interested in having a partisan position on anything.
Does Fico and the White House at all have a point that this could be EU representatives attempting to kind of paint the president in a bad light and drive a wedge between him and one of his allies?
I actually don't think anyone is trying to drive a wedge between him. I don't think that was the point of the story. I think, certainly from the conversations that I have had with my sources, and I know my co-author Nick Vineker had similar conversations. This is not a story about it was not meant to bring down the Fico-Trump bromance. I think the importance of the story, the point that we were making, is that even people who are very close to Trump and who are normally allied with Trump, are having a different experience behind closed doors with Trump than they actually reveal. And I think we've all seen some of the ways in which a meeting with Donald Trump can go terribly for a leader. We saw it with Volodymyr Zelensky. Obviously, that's the big example. But my background is I'm formerly an Australian reporter, and it was during the first Trump term when Donald Trump had a terrible conversation with Malcolm Turnbull, who was our prime minister at the time. Famously terrible conversation where these are two formerly very close allies, or even now really very close allies. You would be hard pressed to find a stronger ally for the US than Australia. And that conversation went terribly wrong. I think it goes to a pattern with Donald Trump, and that's the point of this story, that, even you can't necessarily depend on a personal relationship you may think you have to protect you from some of the elements of those conversations with Donald Trump. If he wants something from you, or if he wants you to change something, sometimes being a friend doesn't necessarily help. So I think that was what the story was meant to highlight. It was not meant to, destroy a relationship or anything like that. It was really to show, firstly, that these leaders who are meeting with Trump directly one in particular has expressed his concern. And importantly, it's not someone you would expect to say that, particularly because Fico himself published several videos after that meeting, which were very complimentary about Trump and about that meeting. So I think it really goes to speak to a wider story in terms of those relationships that Trump has with other leaders.
We've certainly seen, I think, on this side of the channel, at least in public, there seems to have been a bit of a shift from EU leaders with everything that happened in Greenland over the last couple of weeks. You being based in Brussels, is that the kind of general sense that you're feeling within the EU?
That's definitely the feeling I got. So I would say the big kind of, I've reported on this myself, that a diplomat described it as a rupture to me, and I think that's a great way of putting it. I would say the rupture occurred when Donald Trump, via Truth Social, his social network, threatened to slap tariffs on countries that were sending troops to Greenland. I think that was the moment, because up until then, it had sort of been words about Greenland and threats and sort of jokes and half, maybe he's joking, maybe he's not joking. And I think in that, they were able to minimize that to some extent, and they were able to sort of say, well, look, I think there's that famous quote, I forget who said it, but it was a member of the Trump administration that, you should take Trump seriously, but not literally. I think that's how the European leaders were viewing things. But it was that threat of sanctions, the threat of the tariffs, that really focused minds, because that takes it from, there was a date, there was the 1st of February was the date that he mentioned. He really he named a number. So it really felt like a very tangible threat, a real threat. And I think that changed people's views, even people who had previously given him the benefit of the doubt. I think there was this sense of we need to really react very strongly and assertively, because if we don't, then we don't know where this is going to end up. And one of the things that I found super interesting is the Danish camp is an interesting one because Danes have historically been extremely close with the US, and they were very deeply involved in the various Middle East wars that the US fought. They go to great pains to point out the fact that they have always supported the United States. Mette Frederiksen, the prime minister, has always been a pro-American. The things that she has said have been pro-American. So I think there was this real sense of betrayal, which we picked up on in our reporting from the Danish camp in Copenhagen, because these were people who had spent years telling their EU friends, like, look, we've got to be close to the US. The US will protect us. The US, is our friend. They were among the top champions of Washington at the European Council table. And then to have this really shocking threat leveled against them with additional, the threat of sanctions as well. I think that was really strong. And so there has been definitely a shift. I think you can see it in the various meetings that the EU leaders have with one another, the various ministers. Like, there is a sense of unity at the EU level and a sense that we've got to work together because we just cannot count on the US.
And with like Mette Frederiksen in particular, I've seen this morning, she's kind of now surging in the polls. See also Anthony Albanese in Australia last year and Mark Carney last year. I guess Denmark, with everything in Greenland, is kind of a special case. Would you expect to see that with other EU leaders, like people like Emmanuel Macron?
I think it really depends. I mean, with Emmanuel Macron, he can't run for re-election, and so I think it's less of an impact for him. And I think the other thing is that Emmanuel Macron is facing like a huge disaster electorally and politically at home with his budget issues. So I think less so on Emmanuel Macron, but certainly there does seem to be a real electoral bonus that you get by standing up and being firm with Donald Trump. I think there are different ways of doing it, and it seems to be the leaders who are sort of somewhat understated in the way that they respond, but strong and don't back down. Those seem to be the ones who get the reaction and the response from the electorate. And Mette Frederiksen was doing poorly in the polls. She was having a really disastrous few months. There had been loss of popularity. There had been question marks raised. And now she really is surging. And I think that is quite interesting. It is a rally around the flag effect as well, because I think there is a sense in Denmark of threat, real active threat, which is quite unprecedented. So I think that is also probably helping things.
Just want to go back to some of the specific claims in the article. Obviously, you said it was sort of 5 diplomats. I think different diplomats said different things. One described the president as dangerous, as you said. One said that Trump seemed to be out of his mind during the encounter. One said that Fico was traumatized by the encounter. And there was another one that said that Fico was worried about his psychological state. Now, I thought that was quite an interesting quote. Does that mean sort of temperament or kind of cognitive ability?
It's hard. Look, I don't know the answer to that question because the way, again, we didn't overhear the conversation ourselves, so it's hard for us to say. So I don't think we can say exactly what it was, but the state of mind is the quote, kind of what was said. So I think that's really what we're looking at. And that could mean a few different things. And I wouldn't want to guess what exactly they meant. And it's important to note that we don't know the details of what actually happened to make Fico feel this way. So what we know is we've got some observations from people about what they observed Fico. So the traumatized thing was an EU diplomat said that Fico seemed traumatized by the meeting with Trump, by what happened behind closed doors. But we don't know exactly what happened. And I think that's really the question here. Only 2 people were in that room, or maybe, look, there were probably aides and things, but it was a pretty small meeting, and we don't know what happened, but we do know that it's part of this trend of leaders meeting Trump and having a difficult time of it.
And I should say that obviously we have no, actual sort of concrete evidence that the president is in any poor health. But I think I started to see parallels between how the sort of conversation about the predecessor Joe Biden shifted. I mean, obviously Trump did that interview with the New York Magazine this week where he sort of flat out denied that he had Alzheimer's and did a whole interview about his health. So there does seem to be sort of, I don't know, a change in conversation, at least in the media around this.
There do seem to be reports asking those questions. Again, I've not done any reporting. I'm a Brussels correspondent. I don't know the scene in the White House. I've not spoken to anyone to that end, but just observing the coverage, yes, I mean, you can see that there have been several stories that have sort of raised these questions.
Just while I've got you, obviously we talked about how EU leaders are kind of dealing with the president's unpredictability. What about some of his closest allies they might deal with? People like JD Vance, Marco Rubio, and Steve Witkoff.
I think it really depends on the individual ally, but there is a sense within Europe, within Brussels, of kind of whiplash because sometimes you'll hear one thing and then hear something different. And I don't think anyone is under any illusions that if JD Vance became president, that they would have a better relationship with JD Vance's administration than they do with Donald Trump's administration. So I think there is a general sense of foreboding about what the relationship may bring and what will happen in the next 3 years. And I think that, there isn't a sense of if magically somehow Donald Trump disappeared and JD Vance came in his place, I don't think there would be a big sigh of relief should that happen. And that's something, part of the conversations that I have with people around town. I ask them, look, what about the prospect of JD Vance as the next president? And they're all pretty universally just as concerned, if not more concerned, about what might happen to that transatlantic relationship under.
He's pretty much in sort of lockstep with Donald Trump at all times, right?
He does appear to be, and look, he hasn't been in the past, so it's actually a little bit difficult to know exactly what JD Vance is thinking because clearly we all have seen the comments that he made about Donald Trump prior to becoming his vice presidential candidate. Quite famously, he has had some not so nice things to say about Donald Trump. So I think it's hard to say really, but what we can talk to is his positions on things like Ukraine. He's been very scathing about about Ukraine, about its chances on the battlefield. He's been very against giving any sort of aid or assistance to Ukraine. So I think we can only really judge on the basis of the positions that he's had, and at least on Ukraine, which is a key thing that the EU needs from the US. It needs support on ensuring that Ukraine is able to stay in the fight. I think we can safely say that Vance is as, if not more, not particularly interested in Ukraine and in dealing with Zelensky than Trump is.
You look today and you see the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Beijing, kind of almost publicly reforming at least that president with Xi Jinping. Now, of course, that meeting has been planned for some time. It's kind of a bit of a coincidence it's happening this week. But does it kind of mark a difference? It marks a difference from UK governments, at least. And I know Politico have written about this. Are we starting to see European leaders kind of look elsewhere for those geopolitical relationships?
I think definitely there is a dawning realization that they need to expand their sphere. And we can see that on the EU level. We saw that there was a big trade deal signed with the EU and India over this week. We've seen lots of efforts made towards ratifying the Mercosur agreement, which the EU has just signed as well. So I think there is a dawning realization that in Donald Trump's America, you can't really count on the US and you've got to diversify. And Beijing is part of that equation. And I think the realization that has dawned on people is also just, well, we're not particularly enamored with the Chinese policies on various things. We don't love their human rights record, but ultimately it's a huge market and there's a lot of possibilities for us. And we need to sort of feel out how we might make use of it because economically, it's important to grow the EU economy. The Europeans have had some problems. They're falling behind and there's a real stagnation in some EU countries. And so there is a feeling that we need to make sure that the economy is growing. And if that means having conversations with Beijing again, to a limited extent, that is happening. And there is definitely a renewed interest in China because I think there is a realization that on the one hand, you're really squeezed because on the one hand, you've got the US under Trump, which is very difficult to deal with, unpredictable. You might get tariffs any day. And on the other hand, you've got China, which is also it's more predictable in some ways, but also Xi Jinping has not shied away from imposing tariffs or imposing blockades on various products from countries where he doesn't like when they've done something. And Australia is a prime example of that, but there are others as well. The Europeans, the UK as well, have at various points been punished by Beijing for certain policy directions. So I think it's really just one of those cases of diversifying your economic kind of reliance on various countries, because if you're trying to rely on just one big player like the US or like China, then you may find yourself in big trouble.
Just finally, Iran is sort of back in the headlines today. Donald Trump's turned up the rhetoric again, threatening more military action. If the US does strike Iran, what would the EU's response be?
Look, I think the EU will probably not respond significantly. I think it will probably be similar to what happened to Venezuela, where the EU may look. I think it's probably going to sit it out because there's not a lot the EU can do, and it doesn't have a particular horse in the race. There is a bit of a coalescing within Europe on certain elements with Iran. So they're in response to the really horrible, horrible crackdown on the protest movement in Iran. We don't know the extent of it. We don't know how many people have died, but it is thousands. There is a move at the EU level. So today, on Thursday, the European foreign ministers are meeting and they're going to sanction many more Iranian entities. We have also reported that they're likely to sanction the Iran Revolutionary Guard. So I think there is a growing momentum to up the pressure on the Iranian regime in other ways. But I think if Donald Trump follows through on some of these threats to bomb Iran, or, he brought up Venezuela in his Truth Social post when he mentioned the Armada that's on its way to Iran. He brought up the Venezuela operation. I think if Trump follows through on that, there's not going to be much the EU does.
Zoya Sheftalovich, thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report.
Thank you for having me.